Welcome to the Young Turks. We got a funky news day for you guys. McCain was in Syria. Surprise! That was kind of weird. Why was he there? What will it lead to? Well, we're going to discuss it later in the program, isn't it? And then it turns out there will be no drones in Texas. That's a new law, except for all the exceptions, which allow for a tremendous number of drones in Texas. We will also explain that later in the program. Now, you remember the story of the young girl having the lesbian relationship? She was a senior with someone on her basketball team who was a freshman. And there was a question about whether she was going to take a plea deal or not, because they were going to call her a sex offender if she went to trial and lost. They made it a misdemeanor if she took the plea deal. Did she take it? My God, you're going to have to watch the rest of the show to find out. What are we starting with? Trayvon Martin. Well, the George Zimmerman trial is, of course, afoot now, at least the early parts of it, and there are some rulings by the judge involved. Turns out the text messages will not be allowed of Trayvon Martin's. Former fights that he got into, not allowed. Marijuana, not allowed, mainly, except there could be a slight exception to that. We're going to have an expert on that. We're going to have our panel on that. But first, ABC News with latest.
A big blow for the defense in the Trayvon Martin case. The judge says the case will not be delayed. Attorneys for George Zimmerman were in court today asking a judge to postpone his murder trial, set to begin in 2 weeks. The judge denied that plea and dealt another setback to the defense. She says Zimmerman's attorneys cannot use Trayvon Martin's familiarity with guns or the toxicology report showing marijuana use in their arguments. Zimmerman is charged with fatally shooting the unarmed teen at a gated Florida community last year.
My views on that might surprise you a little bit. Twisty twist coming up in just a little bit. But I've got more from NBC News this time.
Until now, photos released by Trayvon Martin's family have mostly shown him as a much younger boy. Now, digital pictures taken from his cell phone show pictures snapped closer to the 17-year-old's death. Also on his cell phone, a marijuana plant and a handgun. And hundreds of text messages, including discussions of after-school fights. The log does not show who's texting and who's responding. I lost the first, but won the second and third. Oh, so it was 3 rounds? Damn, well, at least you won, LOL. But you need to stop fighting back, for real.
LOL indeed. Okay. Now, should those text messages have been included, we're going to have that conversation. First of all, I got my all-star panel here. Look at this. I mean, you want to talk about hosts galore. Michael Schur, host of the War Room with Michael Schur. Okay, and then you got Mark Thompson here, host of The Edge. That's edge-show.com.
If you go down today, we are ready. Either one of us.
Yeah, we are the union of Cenk Uygur fill-in hosts.
That's right. And if you look to your right on that screen, Kim Horcher, host of the Nerd Alert, also here. Okay. Now, she won't be part of the show, but there she is. Our producers are here. John Iderolo, host of TYT University, also down the road. Okay. Now, also joining us in the studio in San Francisco is Lee Fung. I think he's in San Francisco. Yeah, there he is. I can tell from the background. Of course, he writes for The Nation, and he's got a new book out too, The Machine, A Field Guide to the Resurgent Right. And as you can see there, Michael Skolnick, the expert on this case, is here. Michael's, of course, political director for Russell Simmons' GlobalGrind.com. He's editor-in-chief there. As editor-in-chief for Global Grind, political director for Russell Simmons. You got it. Michael, go. No, all right, I got to ask you a question. Okay, on this case, look, I know that they're still considering whether they're going to admit the evidence of his toxicology report on Trayvon Martin, whether he had marijuana in his system and whether that was relevant. I kind of think that's a no-brainer. You know, I was outraged by the injustice of Zimmerman not being charged, but now that we're in the trial phase, don't they have to admit the marijuana in his system? I mean, look, I think it's totally irrelevant in the sense that who cares if he had marijuana in his system, but it's relevant evidence in a trial where we're talking about somebody killing somebody else and what they did in the midst of a fight.
Yeah, I think that they'll admit that evidence. I think the sad part in all this, though, is that George Zimmerman, the night he killed Trayvon, he wasn't tested by the police. There's no toxicology report of what Zimmerman might have been on that night, but there is one of Trayvon. So sadly, the victim is the one who has a toxicology report, and the perpetrator has nothing.
No, that was part of the original injustice, no question about that. But, Michael, I want to start with you on this and then open it up to the panel, too. How about the text messages and whether Trayvon was getting in a lot of fights or not? Look, I've always thought that if you're going to have a trial by jury, you let the jury decide what's relevant and not relevant. For example, you admit to marijuana, but then the jury, if I was on the jury, I think it might make you more mellow, not more bellicose, right? And at the same time, has he been fighting a lot in the past? Look, a reasonable human being could say that could be relevant. Well, what's your take on that, Michael?
Well, I think there's a last-ditch attempt by the defense to just throw, a lot of stuff in the air and see what sticks into the wall. On Friday, they threw everything out there. They leaked all these photographs and these text messages, and many members of the media just went out there and said, oh, look, here's evidence of Trayvon's past. Maybe, just maybe, he was a thug. Maybe he could fight. Maybe he could smoke weed and get high and want to be hostile. Maybe he was upset that day with his quote-unquote girlfriend. All these maybes. But to me, none of it is relevant. The only thing that's relevant is what happened in those 7 minutes, because Trayvon Martin is not on trial. George Zimmerman is the one who's on trial. And those 7 minutes that when two strangers encountered each other, and what happened in those 7 minutes, whether Zimmerman was a good fighter or Trayvon was a good fighter, previous to those 7 minutes, to me, does not matter at all. What matters is those 7 minutes on that Sunday night, what happened during that time, and did George Zimmerman murder Trayvon Martin?
Of course, I agree with Michael, but they are putting Trayvon on trial, and that's what defense attorneys do in these situations. We've seen it in rape cases over and over and over again. It's a reprehensible, in a way, a reprehensible way to go, to dirty up the victim who's not around to defend themselves. But it is something that's done repeatedly, and it's. I think that we're seeing it in spades in this situation. It's remarkable how, as you say, if marijuana's in the system, it would likely mellow him out. But they're, and that's where I agree with Michael. They are throwing everything up against the wall.
Well, in the case of marijuana, though, a jury can see marijuana and have an opinion of someone based solely on the fact that they were smoking marijuana. This is, at its core, a case about profiling. He was killed. The prosecution is going to go after him for killing while profiling Trayvon Martin. If you then put the jury in the position to profile him because of marijuana use, that's totally unfair. So I disagree with you, Cenk, on being able to admit that. He said, the judge said he's not going to let the marijuana use come into the opening statements. He'll reserve judgment as to whether or not he will talk about it. They can talk about it later in the trial.
Yeah, it's my old bias that I guess we're to say, look, judges, if they were going to decide the case, and Lee, I want to ask you about this too. Look, if they're going to decide the case, they get to hear all of this. Right? Obviously, the judge has got to hear it, right? And then say, well, look, I can put it out of my mind because I'm smart enough to be able to do that. But we're going to let the jury decide whether a person goes to jail forever or maybe even gets a death penalty in some cases. But we don't think they're smart enough to be able to put aside his gold teeth that would be too prejudicial to them.
Right.
Whereas, Lee, I'm saying I think maybe it's not too prejudicial. Like, I understand the argument that Michael Skolnick is making and Mark is making. I know why the defense wants to put in there, oh, look at that crazy guy with gold teeth. He probably had it coming. But then if we trust the jury, shouldn't we trust them enough to say that they're not going to make that mistake?
Well, I kind of agree with Michael here. There's kind of a structural imbalance here because you have a right-wing echo chamber that's very interested in the racial politics of this case. And this has kind of become the Breitbart Fox News legal defense to disseminate these type of pictures that paint a very nasty caricature. And they're, repeated on Fox News and on conservative media. And that's shaping the opinions of the jurors here. But it's not really reflecting maybe the facts of the case and what happened in those 6 or 7 minutes.
Michael Skolnick,
I think... Yeah, I think, Cenk, I think the argument's a little bit dangerous because if you talk about a rape case, which a lot of folks are familiar with in terms of painting the victim as promiscuous, or she had sex 15 times the week before, therefore she might have wanted it. So I think the judge has to make decisions in cases like this, or else it's a free for all.
No, I hear you guys, and I know that there has to be some boundaries, but I don't know if it's a liberal thing or a conservative thing, but I just think the parameters should be much larger. I think if a judge can decide whether she had sex 15 times in the last week is relevant or not, then a jury should be able to decide. Otherwise, don't let the jury decide it. Apparently, that means you don't trust the jury, that they can't make those decisions. But Michael, I want to ask you one more thing about this trial. They're apparently not going to view the crime scene either. I found that kind of weird. I mean, it looks like these are pro-prosecution decisions, but I'm not even sure which way that cuts. Why wouldn't we want to see the crime scene or have the jury see the crime scene?
Well, I think that the prosecution certainly had a good day today, and I think Zimmerman's defense had a very tough day. I think the initial argument about sequestering the jury and not allowing anyone to see the jury, and then saying, but we'll allow the jury to walk outside and see this crime scene. I think the judge was taken aback by that. I think, personally speaking, I think Mark Romero's compromise to put the jury in a van with tinted windows and drive them through the crime scene isn't a problem. I think the judge should allow that. But I guess, in technology in this day and age, you can bring a videotape or, bring in photographs and can recreate the crime scene in the courtroom. But I think for the safety of the jury, I think the judge felt that she couldn't allow that to happen.
Well, last thing on this, guys. Should the jury be sequestered because of what Lee mentioned? I mean, they're going to be getting barraged by the Breitbarts and the Fox Newses and whoever else, maybe from the other side. Obviously not us, because apparently I'm on the side of the defense now. Okay, not overall. I'm just saying on these procedural issues, right?
I mean, if ever a case was ripe for sequestration of a jury, then whether or not I'm not legally expert enough to say when it's called for. This does seem like
this never stopped anyone on the show before, Michael. Who cares about you?
What I learned, you took my line. What I learned on the practice then was that yes, they should definitely sequester the jury. Do it.
Okay, thank you, Mark. You get the final word because you're the voice of cops.
The fact is, they're muddying this water. They muddy the water by trying to throw all these things in, everything from gold teeth to text messages to marijuana use. And I think that if the water gets muddy enough, to your point, the jury does lose sight of the simple fact that Zimmerman killed this young man, and he has to account for the reason he killed him. And it's got nothing to do with any of those things, or I suspect very little. So I'm for the judge ruling on these things. I guess I'm siding against you a little bit.
I think so. I think it actually, if there was a count at home, it might have been 4-1 against me. But nonetheless, I'm the judge, so you guys are all wrong. We're admitting all the evidence in the TYT Supreme Court.